Why does bring up a topic mean to mention something? And what does hang out really have to do with hanging? Phrasal verbs like bring up, hang out are often one of the most confusing parts of learning English for a lot of people. Part of this is because the words can feel so unrelated to one another and unrelated to the meaning. So they seem really difficult to guess. And for that reason, a lot of people prefer to avoid them and use single verb alternatives instead. For example, instead of saying, I'm going to put off doing this task or doing my homework, a lot of people opt to say, I'm going to postpone doing it or I'm going to delay doing it, which is fine, but there is a bit of an issue. If you're going to try to avoid all phrasal verbs in every situation, there's not always a single word alternative to this word that will sound good, be frequent, and make sense. Often these words sound very formal. And then you have situations like if you wanted to say turn off or turn on the light, where there's not really a normal way to say that without a phrasal verb. So it's important to remember that phrasal verbs are a core part of the English language itself. They're not just slang or idioms, they are used in all registers. They're used in a formal setting, specific ones, of course, probably not hang out, but they are also used in everyday conversations as well. Also, phrasal verbs add nuance to what you're saying. So it's different to write something out, write it up, write it down. They can add more specificity to what you're saying. So they add a lot of richness to the English language. And surprisingly, they do have some underlying patterns, which will help you use them in a more effective way and understand them better. So that's why I'm making this video. Part of the problem is typically how they're taught. So I do not blame any English learner for being confused by phrasal verbs. I think that the way that we learn language really needs to change. And I also think the way that phrasal verbs specifically are taught is not the most effective way. Because students tend to learn phrasal verbs as isolated vocabulary items when really they are part of a larger system. This approach makes phrasal verbs look unpredictable and random, and it ignores two important things. First, the role of the particle and how it contributes meaning. So, this second word like up, out, off. For example, up can signal completion. I ate it up. Or you used up all of my toothpaste. You used it completely. It also ignores how the meanings can evolve from literal to abstract. And that is really important because a lot of the phrasal verbs that we have today that seem so completely random do have some sort of concrete use that they came from or a metaphor. For example, in the case of the phrasal verb to pass away, which means to die, there's this really common idea or metaphor in a lot of languages about people dying in one lifetime and passing and going on to the next lifetime, going to the afterlife. So, a lot of the more abstract uses of phrasal verbs also have some sort of logic, even if we trace it far back. I am a firm believer that when something looks confusing, we need to look at it more closely and try to understand it. In this first episode, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. I'm going to explain what a phrasal verb is so that you can understand exactly what a phrasal verb is, the key components, what the meanings can be, because there are different types of phrasal verbs as well. And yeah, I plan for this series to continue beyond this episode where I will give you a lot of different strategies for learning and really understanding phrasal verbs. So they're no longer your English enemy, but actually something that you feel confident and comfortable using when speaking in English. Before I continue, in case you don't know, my name is Maggie. I run this page called Charm English. I am an English teacher and I post content on social media on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. I also teach classes. That's my main job. So during the day, I teach classes on my website, which is charmenglish.app. And those are group classes of maximum 4 people at B1 and B2 level. We practice speaking in English. I introduce new vocabulary, new tasks to really challenge the students to improve their level. So we're working on fluency, but we're also working on trying to have more words at your disposal, more ways you can use your English for creative tasks and collaborating with one another. And yeah, they're a lot of fun. So check those out at charmenglish.app or the description of this episode. Okay, so the $1,000,000 question, what is a phrasal verb? Because there are a lot of misconceptions about what they are. Sometimes I see students just throwing together 2 or 3 words or saying something like, make the bed. Is that a phrasal verb? No, not every group of words that makes a phrase is a phrasal verb. So, specifically, a phrasal verb is a verb plus a particle, like up, out, in, off, those small words that form a single unit of meaning together. So, the verb and the particle together, like bring up, means to mention something. When verbs combine with these particles, the meaning of the whole expression can shift in ways that are not obvious at first. The particle in a phrasal verb often looks identical to a preposition, like I'm on the bus, I'm in my house, but it behaves differently. Historically, many of these particles originally described movement, position, or direction in space. This helps explain why so many phrasal verbs are connected to ideas like movement, completion, continuation, or change. Although English has thousands of phrasal verbs, the number of particles used to create them is actually quite small. The particles that appear in phrasal verbs are aback, aboard, about, above, across, after, ahead, along, apart, around, ashore, aside, astray, asunder, away, back, behind, by, down, forth, forward, forwards, home, in, off, on, out, over, past, round, through, to, under, and up. Some of these particles, like up, out, and in, are very common in everyday speech. Others, like asunder or astray, are mostly found in historical documents or older literary forms of English. We don't really use aback in many phrasal verbs other than to be taken aback. Similarly, we don't see forth used that much with new phrasal verbs. Older texts might have expressions like go forth into the world. I believe that's in the Bible. This evolution shows that phrasal verbs, like the rest of the English language, are constantly changing. So there are some that are no longer productive and being used in new phrasal verbs, but we also have some that have been around for so long that they're kind of like fixed expressions, like taken aback. Because particles and prepositions look the same, learners often get confused between a phrasal verb and a prepositional verb, like to wait for the bus, which is not a phrasal verb, that's a prepositional verb. You can use these diagnostics to tell them apart. So, first we have the movement test. So, with many transitive phrasal verbs, the particle is mobile. You can move the object between the verb and the particle. With prepositional verbs, the preposition is glued to its object. So, for example, turn off the light or turn the light off. We're able to move it, and off and turn are still working together, whether the light is in between or not. On the other hand, this is very commonly listed as a phrasal verb, but technically it's not. Look after. So look after the baby, we're not able to say look the baby after. And this gets into separable versus inseparable phrasal verbs. A lot of teachers divide phrasal verbs by separable and inseparable. And often what you'll find is if it's an inseparable phrasal verb, technically, grammatically, it's a prepositional verb because after here is working like a preposition and not like an adverbial particle, which is really specific. Maybe you don't need to know that, but I do think it helps to understand that there is a reason why some phrasal verbs are separable versus inseparable. And it depends on if that particle is working like a preposition or an adverbial particle. The second thing is the pronoun rule. So if the object is a pronoun, like it, him, her, them, it must go in the middle of a phrasal verb. In a prepositional verb, it stays at the end. So, for example, turn it off, we don't turn off it. If you have a pronoun, it has to be a sandwich, turn it off. But if you have something like wait for him, we don't say wait him for, right? The for is needed to connect the verb to the object. Then this is not really like a good enough test, but it's an interesting observation. We can pay attention to what word you're stressing in the phrasal verb. So, very often when it's a phrasal verb, we emphasize the particle more. So, sit down, figure it out. But when it's a prepositional verb, usually the verb is being emphasized and not the preposition. So listen to her or wait for the bus. So you'll notice that in phrasal verbs, often people are emphasizing the particle. And in a prepositional verb phrase, people often emphasize the verb and reduce the preposition. So it's important to recognize that phrasal verbs are not just every idiomatic expression. Like over the moon is not a phrasal verb. It's not a verb with a particle where the particle is influencing the meaning of the verb. And then also we have a lot of prepositional verbs like run into someone, come across something, or look after someone that are often grouped together as phrasal verbs because they have these idiomatic meanings and it's like a particle plus a verb. But grammatically speaking, those are prepositional verbs. So they're often taught all together because the idea is for you to learn these common expressions, which a lot of teachers kind of group them together, like phrases that you should learn, which is honestly fine. But it helps to understand that really, when you're talking about the grammar, there's a difference between the ones that can be separated and not separated. So, phrasal verbs are built mostly from short verbs of Germanic origin, like take, get, go, make, and come. Because a small set of particles can combine with these common verbs in endless ways, it creates a vast and flexible system. As the linguist Dwight Bollinger observed, phrasal verbs could almost be defined by listing them, but such a list could never be complete because new combinations continue to emerge every day. We have zoom in, zoom out. Even with technology, we have new phrasal verbs. The most common phrasal verbs in English are highly concentrated, though, within a small set of 20 high frequency dilexical verbs, combined with a limited number of particles. Corpus research from the British National Corpus, BNC, indicates that just 25 phrasal verbs account for nearly one third of all occurrences, and the top 100 account for more than half. So, usage is dominated by a few core verbs of movement or action, which generate dozens of distinct meanings when combined with particles. We have get up, get down, get in, get out, get on, get off, get away, get back, take, take off, take on, take out, take in, take up, take back, take over, put on, put off, put out, put in, put up, put down, put away, go, go off, go on, go out, go in, go up, go down, go away, go back, come on, come in, come out, come back, come up. Specifically, the top specific combinations that linguistic studies have consistently identified as being the most frequent individual combinations in both British and US English are find out, number one, carry out, point out, set up, turn out, give up, make up, sit down, and look up. So these are the most common phrasal verbs that are frequently identified when looking at corpus data, which is research of all of the frequently used words that people use online, for example, and in documents that the researchers have access to. So those are the most common ones. If you're like, this seems crazy, I don't know what to study first, here you go. Find out, carry out, point out, set up, turn out, give up, make up, sit down, look up. Did I say that like a rap on purpose? A little bit. While there are over 5,000 phrasal verbs, the vast majority utilize a core group of approximately 8 adverbial particles. So the particle up is the most frequent and important, appearing in more than twice as many combinations as its nearest rival, which is out. Other core particles include in, on, off, down, back, and away. The frequency of these common phrasal verbs varies significantly by register. So, for example, get up and sit down are ubiquitous in fiction and spoken conversation, but rare in academic prose, where the subject matter is more abstract. Conversely, make up and carry out are highly frequent in news and academic writing because they relate to describing evidence or implementing policies, for example. And you can see in the news also, we have a lot of phrasal verbs that you can frequently see in headlines because, like I said before, the particles tend to relate to increasing things, movement, change. And so a lot of phrasal verbs that relate to those topics can be seen in the media. Now let's talk about how phrasal verb meanings work, because understanding their structure is only one part of it. To really understand phrasal verbs, we also need to look at how their meanings work. So, one reason phrasal verbs are so challenging is that their meanings do not all follow the same pattern. Linguists describe 3 different broad types of meaning. We have literal, aspectual, and idiomatic. These categories are helpful, but they should be seen kind of like points on a spectrum instead of separate groups, because oftentimes what happens is something is literal, but then there's an idiomatic usage for it, or it's literal, but then we start to use that particle in an aspectual way with other words. So phrasal verbs follow a relatively logical, according to me, evolutionary path from physical actions to abstract concepts. At the most basic level, you have concrete compositional verbs. These are literal and spatial. Many people don't even count these as phrasal verbs, but they're helpful to understand where the subject comes from. So if you sit down or throw out the trash, the words mean exactly what you say. You're moving your body or an object in a specific direction. Historically, this is where phrasal verbs started as simple descriptions of moving things around in the real world before we had, as complicated of a society as we do today. Over time, these physical directions started being used to describe how an action flows, creating aspectual phrasal verbs. Here, the particle, like up, on, or out, stops being about literal space and starts acting as a modifier for completion or duration. For example, the up in eat up or lock up has nothing to do with the direction, it's a marker of totality, meaning the job is 100% finished. Similarly, on shifted from representing a physical surface to representing a continuous timeline, which is why we carry on with a conversation, or he goes on, or the meeting dragged on. The final stage of this evolution is the idiomatic phrasal verb, where the meaning becomes non compositional. The individual words don't give away the definition. These usually started as metaphors that eventually detached from their literal roots. To bring up a child likely began with the physical act of rearing or raising someone as they got taller, but it eventually morphed into the abstract concept of parenting. By recognizing that even the weirdest idioms usually have a ghost of a physical ancestor, you can see them as a functional system instead of random words thrown together. So let's look at some literal compositional meanings. In some cases, the meaning of a phrasal verb is transparent, meaning it can be understood directly from its parts. For example, to sit down, to stand up, walk out, or come in. Here, the particle keeps its original spatial meaning and the action happens in the direction described. These are the most straightforward and easy to understand. If you are super unsure about phrasal verbs, I recommend starting with this. Just get better at describing actions happening by saying the verb, the action, and then adding the preposition to talk about what direction the action happened in. Then we have aspectual meanings. So, in other cases, the particle does not describe the physical direction, but instead it changes how we interpret the action. So, for example, like I mentioned, he used our supplies or he used our supplies up. Both describe the same action, but we use up to emphasize completion. The supplies are completely gone. This is known as an aspectual meaning because the particle shapes how the action develops over time. Certain particles frequently contribute to these meanings. Up is like completion or intensity, to drink up, finish up, clear up. Out is often used for exhaustion or disappearance, to run out, wear out, or die out. Through is often used for completing a process, like to think through or talk through something. And over is used for transfer or completion, like to hand over or to think over. Some particles can also express continuation, like she chatted away for hours or he talked on without noticing. In these cases, the particle does not describe location, but rather the nature or progression of the action. So we can see why it's kind of used like an adverb in these cases. Side note, there is a false perception that people in US English use more phrasal verbs than people in British English, which is not really the case. There have been studies looking at how in British and US English, phrasal verbs are very much a core part of the language. But one thing that did come up is likely people from the US use more aspectual phrasal verbs. And that could also give a sense of people using them more often because they might be used in ways that, to someone that's an English learner, are not entirely necessary, but they are adding this nuanced meaning to the action. Finally, we have phrasal verbs that have meanings that cannot be predicted from the individual parts. These are idiomatic or non compositional. So you can't really look at the phrasal verb and know what it means necessarily. So we have to give up, which is to quit, not really anything to do with give or up. We have to give in, which is to surrender, get by, which is to manage or survive, and to make out, meaning to understand. Like, oh, I can't make out the directions, or I can't make out the text that is in front of me. It's not really clear. I'm not able to read it clearly. So these meanings developed gradually over time and are now fixed expressions. They must generally be learned as whole units, although many still have historical connections to earlier, more literal meanings. I'm pretty sure give up, I'll have to look into this more, but there's something to do with surrendering in battle. I don't know. If any of you knows about the history of give up, please comment, but that will be something for me to continue in research. It's also interesting to think about why phrasal verbs are so common. One of the reasons is because naturally our brain does something called chunking, which is where instead of treating every word like a separate piece of data, the brain groups common combinations like carry on or bring up into single functional units. In linguistics, this is called lexicalization. For a learner, this means that fluent speakers do not build the phrase take off by thinking of the verb take and then thinking of the particle off separately. They receive the entire unit from their memory as if it were a single word. Like that space there is there, but not when you're thinking of the meaning, right? This process significantly reduces brain power, cognitive load during a conversation, allowing for much faster and more automatic speech. This came up to me when I was talking to my grandma, and she asked me what the hardest thing was for English learners to learn. And I mentioned phrasal verbs, and you'd be surprised that she did not know what a phrasal verb was. I was like, Grandma, it's when you say, for example, I'm going to turn on the light. You're not turning, you know, activating the switch, but people get confused as to what that has to do with turn and on. And she looked at me and was like, I guess you're right. That's true. That could be confusing. And I gave her a few more examples where I had to explain that the components did not equal the meaning because she's a monolingual English speaker. She did not understand that people would be looking at the individual words when for her, that phrasal verb equals one lexicalized meaning. There's also entrenchment, which is a frequency effect. The more often you hear a specific combination, the more etched it becomes in your memory, which makes it easier to just pull out your mental files instantly. And this is why common phrasal verbs like get up feel much easier to use than rare ones like to gnaw away at. The former one is deeply entrenched. So a lot of you might already know phrasal verbs like wake up, turn on the light, go away, that you hear all the time as kind of a fixed expression. And like I mentioned before, with the aspectual meaning of the particles in phrasal verbs, like the particle up meaning completion or doing something totally. And you can see this logic in eat up, clean up, and wrap up, like finishing a task. This system is logical. And because of that, you can often guess the meaning of a new phrase. So if you know that off often implies separation or departure, you can easily understand that set off is to start a journey or cut off is to separate a piece. This happens to me because in British English, they use a lot of different phrasal verbs. A lot of the more common ones, like what I mentioned before, figure out, are the same, but looking at, for example, bugger off, excuse my French. Yeah, that's not one that people use in the US, but hearing something like that, it's really easy for me to understand that you're telling someone to go away because off is connected oftentimes to leaving, right? And this productivity that we have, where the word, where the particle can be used with new verbs or different verbs, helps the language grow and adapt to new situations. So, for example, as technology changed, English speakers didn't need to invent entirely new words. We just needed to apply existing particle patterns to create words like log in, scroll down, power up. By understanding that phrasal verbs are both pre-made chunks for speed and also logical patterns for creativity, you can move away from memorizing the long lists and try to start recognizing the underlying system that makes English flow naturally. All right, so that's my explanation about what phrasal verbs are. Hopefully, it was understandable. There is a lot to unpack here, and I don't expect you to watch this video once and feel like a phrasal verb expert, but my main takeaways are first, that if you get more used to this logic of using a verb and particle together, even if it's just movement at first, like I walked in, I walked up, that will help you start to get used to the idea of phrasal verbs. Another thing that I want you to take away from this video is the idea that a lot of phrasal verbs can be understood if you know the different meanings of aspectual particles. So I recommend looking at Phrasal Verb Demon has a really great list for each particle of the logic behind it and what it could mean. So that's really helpful for being able to predict and guess new phrasal verbs, because you're not always going to, since you can't memorize, I don't think, every single phrasal verb, they're infinite. It helps to be able to guess what they are based on the particle. And also, that meaning can go from concrete to abstract. And that's true not only in English and not only with phrasal verbs, but in language in general. In my next video, I'm going to go deeper into the history of phrasal verbs, which is very interesting because I myself was very surprised. I had to consult a book about the history of phrasal verbs for that part of the series, and you'll be surprised. If you speak a Germanic language, you might be used to having little particles with verbs already. They don't work exactly the same, but that is kind of the same thing where it came from. And same thing if you speak a Romance language, the prefixes also came originally from detached particles that were used in Proto Indo European. So, all of that to say thank you for listening to this episode. Give me a like and subscribe if it was helpful so that you can see my next videos in the series where I plan to go deeper into different aspects of phrasal verbs. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.